The United States covers nearly 10 million square kilometers. Most people picture the same dozen places: New York, the Grand Canyon, a handful of national parks. They never see the towns that simply stopped. There is a town in Utah that sits at the bottom of a lake, its rooftops once drifting away like rafts. There is a town in Colorado, frozen in the mid-1980s, with rows of pastel houses staring down from a 600-foot cliff. There is a Pennsylvania city that grew to 20,000 people in a matter of months, then vanished from the earth in under 4 years. And there is one town that mined the lead for the bullets that won 2 world wars, and poisoned its own children doing it. Make sure you stick with us to the end, because that one is number 1 on this list. This is the channel where we walk through the places history left behind. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. We post stories like this every week. Today we are counting down 10 of America's creepiest ghost towns almost nobody knows exist. Let's go. Number 10, Garnet, Montana, the town they walked away from, twice. East of Missoula, up a dirt road into the Garnet Range, there is a town at about 6,000 feet that almost nobody ever finished leaving. Garnet grew up around a gold quartz vein and a stamp mill built around 1895. The buildings went up fast and cheap, small, easy to heat, most of them without foundations. Nobody who built Garnet expected it to last. It didn't. By early 1898, close to 1,000 people lived there. By 1905, after the easy gold thinned out, only about 150 remained. A fire tore through the commercial buildings in 1912. Then something strange happened. In the 1930s, when the price of gold jumped from $16 an ounce to $35, miners moved back into the abandoned cabins and the town came halfway back to life, around 250 people. World War II pulled them out again. The post office closed for good in 1942. The storekeeper, Frank Davey, stayed until he died in 1947. Here is what makes Garnet eerie. Both times people left, they left in a hurry, and they left things behind. The Bureau of Land Management stepped in to preserve it in 1971, and more than 80 buildings are still standing. Many of them you can walk straight into. Travel and Leisure compared the false front Main Street to the set of Red Dead Redemption 2. You can visit from late spring through September. In winter, the BLM rents out 2 of the original cabins to anyone willing to ski or snowmobile in. People built Garnet never meaning to stay. They were right twice, and the buildings outlasted all of them anyway. Number 9. Cisco, Utah, the town that outlived its own reason to exist. Hollywood keeps coming to Cisco to kill people on camera. The car chase in Vanishing Point, the desert scenes in Thelma and Louise, a stretch of Don't Come Knocking, all shot in and around this crumbling spot in the Utah desert near the Colorado border. Johnny Cash wrote a song about its gas station, Cisco Clifton's Fill-In Station. For a ghost town, Cisco has a remarkable filmography. It started in the 1880s for the least glamorous reason imaginable. Steam locomotives on the Denver and Rio Grande Western needed water, and Cisco had a stop that pumped it up from the Colorado River. About 3.5 miles away, a town grew around the tap. At the turn of the century, it was a serious sheep-shearing center. Legends of America puts the number as high as 100,000 head sheared here in a season. An oil and gas boom arrived in 1924. By the 1950s, around 200 people lived in Cisco. Then the railroad switched to diesel and stopped needing water. Then Interstate 70 was routed miles away, and the road trippers stopped coming. By the 1990s, the post office closed, and Cisco was officially dead. Except it isn't quite. Since 2015, an artist named Eileen Musa has lived here, rebuilding the place from salvage and running an art residency with an Airbnb in the old post office. She does not love the phrase ghost town. As she has pointed out to reporters, she lives there. A town can lose its entire reason for existing and still refuse to disappear as long as one person decides it's home. Number 8. Glenrio, the town in 2 states and no time zone of its own. In Glenrio, all the bars were on one side of town and all the gas stations were on the other, and it had nothing to do with where the drivers wanted them. Glenrio sits directly on the Texas-New Mexico state line. Half its addresses are in Texas, half in New Mexico, and the people who built it treated that line as a business plan. The Texas sat in a dry county, so the bars, including the state line bar, all went up on the New Mexico side. New Mexico's gasoline tax was higher, so the filling stations clustered on the Texas side. The railroad depot was in Texas, but the post office was in New Mexico, which meant the mail physically crossed state lines just to get sorted. Glenrio began as a railroad hamlet in the early 1900s, then reinvented itself when Route 66 was paved through in the 1930s. Motels, diners, and service stations lined the mother road. A scene from the film of The Grapes of Wrath was shot on Glenrio's single dusty street. The town never held more than a few dozen residents, but the constant flow of Route 66 traffic kept everyone in business. Then the traffic left. The Rock Island Railroad Station closed in 1955. Interstate 40 was finished around 1973, and it bypassed the town entirely. The economy was the road, and the road moved. Today there is a cluster of derelict buildings, the Texas Longhorn Motel, the State Line Cafe, an old Texaco station, the empty shell of the post office. One occupied house remains. The motel sign is the detail people remember. One face reads Last Motel in Texas. The other reads First Motel in Texas, depending only on which way you happen to be driving. A town that spent 50 years being clever about a line in the dirt, undone by a faster line drawn a mile to the north. Number 7. Thurmond, West Virginia. The town with no street, now owned by the government. Thurmond never really had a main street. It was built on a sliver of flat ground in the New River Gorge, packed so tightly against the railroad tracks that its commercial buildings fronted directly onto the rails. There was nowhere else to put them. The gorge walls came down to the river, and the town fit in the gap. For about 35 years, the only way in or out was by train. The depot was built in 1888. Coal built the rest. At its peak, Thurmond had 2 banks, 2 hotels, a movie theater, and restaurants, and it ran around 15 passenger trains a day. By some accounts, it handled more freight than Cincinnati. A few sources add Richmond to that comparison. Across the river was the Dun Glen Hotel, and local lore still claims it hosted the longest-running poker game in history, said to have run 14 years. Treat that one as legend. It is too good to confirm. What killed Thurmond was the same thing that built it. A rail-only town wedged against a cliff has nowhere to grow. When good roads arrived and the railroads switched from steam to diesel around 1950, Thurmond's reason for existing thinned out. A series of fires didn't help. The population, several hundred at the turn of the century, fell to 462 by 1930, then kept falling. The 2020 census recorded a population of 5. That makes Thurmond the least populous municipality in West Virginia. The National Park Service now owns roughly 80% of the town as part of New River Gorge National Park. The restored 1904 depot is a visitor center. About 20 historic structures survive: the brick commercial row, the 1922 coaling tower, the broken walls of the Lafayette Hotel, and you can still arrive the way everyone once did. Amtrak's Cardinal stops here 3 times a week in each direction. 15 trains a day once, 5 residents now, and a depot that greets tourists instead of coal barons. Number 6. Old Cahaba, Alabama, the capital that drowned, then came back as a prison. Alabama's very first state capital is a ghost town. Most people who live in Alabama have never heard of it. Cahaba was carved out of the wilderness in 1819, at the point where the Cahaba and Alabama rivers meet, to be the brand new state's seat of government. It was, in a sense, a political invention. President Monroe gifted the land. Governor William Wyatt Bibb pushed hard to make it the permanent capital. The legislature met temporarily in Huntsville while the State House went up. Then Bibb died in 1820, and Cahaba lost its protector. Rivals seized on the town's reputation for flooding, a reputation that was largely exaggerated, and in 1826 the capital was moved to Tuscaloosa. The town nearly emptied overnight. It came back. Cotton money rebuilt Cahaba into a wealthy antebellum river town of around 3,000 people. During the Civil War, it held a Confederate prison for captured Union soldiers, a place sometimes called Castle Morgan. Then the war stripped away its railroad, and in 1866 its status as county seat. The population melted away, except for newly freed black residents, who organized politically in the abandoned courthouse. One of their leaders, Jeremiah Harrelson, had been born into slavery. He went on to serve in the United States Congress. After that, the town consumed itself. Buildings were dismantled and floated downriver to other towns. By 1900, Cahaba was gone. What's left is Old Cahaba Archaeological Park, empty streets, crumbling brick columns, an old cemetery, and a skeletal frame the Historical Commission built to mark where the vanished capital once stood. And there is the legend. Locals still report a glowing orb of light that drifts near the old cemetery and the ruins of the slave quarters. Some say it's a lost Confederate soldier. Some say a Union prisoner who died at the camp. Nobody can say what it is, which is exactly why people keep going back to look. A capital built by a decision, abandoned by a decision, and finally taken apart and shipped away piece by piece, until the only thing left to argue about was the light. If you are finding this video interesting, drop a thumbs up, and tell us in the comments which of these towns you would actually be willing to visit. After dark, we read everyone. We have covered the strange and the quiet so far, From here, it gets heavier. Number 5. Pithole City, Pennsylvania. The city that lived and died in 500 days. There was a city here, 20,000 people, give or take. Now there is mowed field with the old street grid marked out in the grass, and a small visitor center with a diorama. That is the entire story of Pithole, except for how it happened. In January 1865, oil was struck at the Frazier Well along Pithole Creek, in the wilderness of Venango County. Two speculators, A.P. Duncan and George Prather, bought farmland and plotted 500 lots that May. Within months, a full city materialized. By December, it was incorporated, with an estimated population around 20,000, one of the fastest-growing cities in America at the time. It had everything a city has. At least 54 hotels, by some counts 57, 3 churches, a theater, a newspaper, a red light district that one account compared to Dodge City. The world's first oil pipeline ran out of Pithole. Its post office was the third busiest in all of Pennsylvania, behind only Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. The New York Times called it Tappan's Mushroom City, and then it was gone. The oil pool underneath was thin and drained fast. A glut crashed the price to around $2.50 a barrel by 1866. News strikes elsewhere pulled the crowd away, and fire after fire swept through the flimsy wooden boomtown. By 1870, a few hundred people remained. In 1877, the borough was formally unincorporated. People didn't just leave, they took the buildings with them, dismantling and selling whatever they could. The Danforth House is the detail people remember. It was a luxury hotel that opened on Christmas Eve of 1865. A few years later, it sold for $16 as firewood. 20,000 people built a city to chase a gusher, and the gusher was the only thing holding it up. Number 4. Gilman, Colorado. The modern town evicted by poison. Most ghost towns are old. Stagecoaches, gold pans, the 1800s. Gilman is not that. Gilman had electricity, running water, and televisions. People were living ordinary 20th century lives here in the 1980s, and then they were ordered to leave. The town sits at nearly 9,000 feet, on the edge of a 600-foot cliff above the Eagle River, between Minturn and Red Cliff. It was a company town, founded in 1886 during the Colorado silver boom, and built right on the cliff, so the miners would be steps from the Eagle mine. Below, that mine was once one of the largest zinc producers in the United States. By 1972, the district had pulled more than $328 million in minerals out of the ground. During World War II, more than 1,000 people lived in Gilman, with around 700 working the mine. Here is what makes it different from the others. A century of mining had poured heavy metals into the Eagle River. One tailings pond reportedly overflowed and turned the river bright orange. In 1984, the EPA stepped in, the mining stopped, and the numbers stopped working. The power was cut. Workers went unpaid. In June 1985, the company evicted the last 14 families and chained off the entrance. In 1986, the site became a 235-acre Superfund site, with around 8 million tons of mine waste. The cleanup was declared finished around 2000. The town is still there. It is private property, fenced, patrolled, and genuinely dangerous, flooded mine chasms below, and buildings ready to collapse above. So you do what everyone does. You look at it from Highway 24. From the switchbacks below, Gilman's neat rows of pastel houses sit with their windows blown out. One local magazine said they smiled down at the passing cars like jack-o'-lanterns. A whole town, suburban-looking and intact, sitting on a cliff above a road full of people who are not allowed to come up. Number 3. Thistle, Utah, the town at the bottom of a lake. In April 1983, a mountainside started to move, and a town disappeared. Thistle sat in Spanish Fork Canyon at the junction of 2 U.S. highways and 2 rail lines, a critical crossroads in a narrow Utah canyon. It was founded in 1883 as a stop on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, and it had been slowly shrinking for decades as the railroad modernized. By 1983, only about 50 people were left, in roughly 22 occupied homes. At its peak, back in 1917, around 600 had lived there. The winter of 1982 into 1983 was extraordinary. Record precipitation, then a deep snowpack, then a fast, warm snowmelt. The saturated slopes above Thistle began to slide. Railway surveyors noticed it first, watching the tracks warp as the ground shifted beneath them. Crews worked around the clock to hold the line in place. It was hopeless. The entire mountainside was coming down, several feet an hour. The railroad gave up and abandoned the line. The state ordered an emergency evacuation, and residents had hours, not days. Then the moving earth did the thing that made Thistle famous. It built a natural dam across the canyon, somewhere between 200 and 220 feet high, and sealed off the Spanish Fork River like a plug in a drain. The water had nowhere to go but up. It rose into a lake as much as 160 feet deep, and it swallowed the town. Residents watched their own rooftops lift off and drift across the new water like rafts. There were no deaths, but the damage was staggering. The slide cut the main rail line between Denver and Salt Lake City and flooded 2 U.S. highways. It triggered Utah's first-ever presidential disaster declaration. Direct damage passed $200 million in 1983 money, and federal and state agencies have called it the most costly landslide in United States history. The lake was eventually drained through diversion culverts. Drive US 6 through Spanish Fork Canyon today, and you can still see the giant scar of the slide and the skeletal, half-sunken remains of buildings down in the bog. A red schoolhouse, a church on a hill, the old rail machine shop. A town that existed only because it was a crossroads, drowned by the very canyon that made it one. Number 2. Times Beach, Missouri. The town the government erased. The United States government once bought an entire American town, evacuated every resident, bulldozed every building, and burned the soil itself. That town was Times Beach, and the reason is one of the strangest environmental disasters in the country's history. It began as a real estate gimmick. In 1925, the St. Louis Times ran a promotion for $67.50, plus a 6-month newspaper subscription. You got a riverfront lot along the Merrimack River, just off what would become Route 66. It grew into a modest working-class town of more than 2,000 people. The roads were unpaved and dusty, so like a lot of small towns, Times Beach hired someone cheap to oil them down. The hauler was a man named Russell Bliss, and the waste oil he sprayed was contaminated with dioxin, a chemical from the same family as the most toxic byproducts of Agent Orange production. For years, nobody knew. Children played in the oiled streets. Then horses in sprayed arenas started dropping dead. Birds died. People got sick. The EPA began testing in the late 1970s, but the full picture didn't land until December 1982, and it landed at the worst possible moment. The Merrimack River flooded that month and washed the contamination across the whole town. On December 23rd, residents were told the entire place was poisoned and would have to be evacuated. Here is the part that stops people cold. There was no cleaning it. The only fix the government could find was to buy the whole town. Figures run between $32 and $36 million. Move everyone out, permanently, demolish every structure, and build an incinerator on site to burn roughly 265,000 tons of contaminated soil. The total bill came to about $250 million. Missouri formally disincorporated the city in 1985. At the time, it was the largest civilian dioxin exposure in U.S. history. And then the strangest turn of all, the site was declared clean, and in 1999 it reopened as Route 66 State Park. A single 1930s roadhouse survives as the visitor center. Everything else is mowed grass, trees, birdsong, and a quiet stretch of old highway. You can stand in the middle of it and never know that 2,000 people once lived under your feet. That is somehow worse than ruins. Number 1. Picher, Oklahoma, the most toxic town in America. You come in off the flat northeastern Oklahoma prairie, and the first thing you notice is that the hills are wrong. They are too gray, too steep, too regular, pale mountains of crushed rock where no mountains should be. The wind picks up the dust off them and carries it across the road. There are warning signs and barbed wire. There is a gutted school. There are concrete steps that climb to nothing, where a house used to be. And there is almost no sound at all, except the wind moving over the waste and, somewhere in the distance, cleanup equipment that has been running for decades and is nowhere near finished. Those gray mountains have a name. They are called Chat, the crushed, metal-laden leftovers of mining. There are roughly 30 of them around Picher, holding something like 178 million tons of toxic waste. Some of them once stood 150 feet tall. Picher was incorporated in 1920 and built on lead and zinc, and it was not a minor operation. The mines here produced an enormous share of the metal that went into American ammunition. The lead Picher pulled out of the ground helped make roughly half the bullets fired in World War I, and the town kept supplying metal straight through World War II. At its height in the 1920s, somewhere between 14 and 20,000 people lived here. It was prosperous, it was patriotic, it was essential. It was also poisoning everyone who lived in it, and no one understood that for a very long time. The Chat was everywhere, so people used it everywhere. Children rode their bikes up and down the piles. Parents filled their kids' sandboxes with it. The creeks ran red from cadmium and other metals, water that people had once swum in. By the 1990s, Roughly 34% of the local children tested positive for lead poisoning. In 1983, the area became the Tar Creek Superfund site, and the EPA called it one of the most toxic places in the entire United States. The ground itself was failing too. The old mine tunnels under the town were collapsing into sinkholes. A federal buyout was already underway when nature delivered the final blow. On May 10, 2008, an EF4 tornado tore through Picher, killing 6 people and destroying scores of homes. After that, between the contamination and the threat of the ground caving in, the conclusion was unavoidable. The town could not be lived in. Picher's incorporated status was officially canceled on September 1, 2009. Most of the homes and businesses were demolished, but not everyone left. A handful of people refused every buyout and stayed in the poisoned ghost town. They had a name for themselves. They called themselves the Chat Rats. The last of them, a pharmacist named Gary Linderman, kept his store open and stayed until he died in 2015. The chat piles are still there, slowly shrinking under a cleanup projected to run for decades more. The creeks are still discolored. The signs still warn you to keep out. You can drive in and look, but you do not linger. This is a place you view and leave. Picher gave the lead that won 2 world wars. It could not, in the end, save itself from what that cost. And the last man there kept his lights on until 2015 anyway. These towns are scattered across a country most people are sure they already know. They don't. For me, the one that stays is Thistle, an entire town under a lake, because a hillside decided to move one wet spring. Which of these surprised you most, and which forgotten town did we miss? Tell us in the comments. If walking through the place's history left behind is your kind of thing, subscribe. We find another one every week.